Who are the top free agent edge rushers that the Falcons could target?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. Knowles, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com. RIP, going strong still on this illustrious podcast. And I think each and every one of you go strong with me. As everydayers, that means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everydayer, all you have to do, guys, all you have to do, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are answering mailbag questions. We'll be talking about what lessons we can learn from the Eagles' successful team building. Will the Falcons make Grady Jarrett take a pay cut or else? You know, why I don't necessarily see Zach Harrison as the answer at edge, even if the Falcons move back to a 4-3. But let's take an early look at some of these free agent edge rushers, because our question comes from Richie B, a Locked On Falcons insider. And he says, I haven't really dug into this year's free agency class yet, since we need to primarily focus on that side of the ball. What defensive position has the most depth / players to choose from in free agency? Who would be some of your top targets for the Falcons? So I think right now, we'll see how this looks a month from now when we get right up on the heels of free agency. But I think right now, edge looks like the position group that probably has the most good options available. And then sort of, I kind of break them down into like 3 or 4 tiers, depending on your math. That top tier of tier 1 edges hitting free agency are Khalil Mack, Chase Young, and Josh Sweat. I think all of these 3 guys are better served as sort of high-end Robins than necessarily Batman at this stage, because, Batman don't really make it to market, if you understand the analogy. So I think these are, these are Nightwings, if you understand the comic book references. Like when Batman is, across the globe dealing with, Ra's al Ghul and, poisoning the Lazarus pit or whatever Batman does. When he does that thing, Gotham still needs a protector, and usually it's Nightwing that steps in to that role. And so I think Khalil Mack and Chase Young and Josh Sweat sort of qualify as high-end, number 2 rushers that can sort of masquerade as a number 1 for a team like the Falcons, who don't necessarily have that one and only are really realistically going to get one if they hit on a draft pick in round 1. But then you get to the next tier, which is I would say tier 1.5. Because these are formerly high-end edges that may be a little bit long in the tooth, maybe have fallen on harder times due to decline or injuries. And those 3 guys would be Hassan Reddick, Matthew Judon, and DeMarcus Lawrence. Obviously, we don't expect the Falcons to run it back with Matthew Judon, but, stranger things have happened. I don't expect them to be that interested in DeMarcus Lawrence, just because he's been dealing with injuries these last couple of years and just really hasn't been a high-end rusher that we're talking about since like 2018. And then Reddick, to me, is an interesting option as maybe a potential 1-year reclamation project, but, it's going to be hard to justify that if you're not willing to spend money, because we basically saw him refuse to play last year without getting paid. And, I doubt you're going to be able to sign him to a cheap deal that you would ideally would want to sign one of these guys as a sort of reclamation project, late career reclamation project. So that gets us to tier 2. Where I feel like this is kind of where the Falcons should be shopping. And these are the sort of the young up-and-coming players: Baron Browning, Azeez Ojulari, Dayo Odeyingbo, Malcolm Kuntz, Josh Uche, and Cam Sample. And these are the guys that I think what you're hoping for is to sign these guys on 1-year prove-it deals, rather than trying to commit, multi-year big guarantees to these guys, because they haven't really proven what they are. We've seen flashes from all of these guys of being, potentially number 2-ish guys, but probably at this stage are probably more number 3-ish guys. They're in a similar tier as Arnold Ebiketie at this stage. But what you're kind of hoping, I think, with signing one of these guys is you're hoping for the next Shaq Barrett. And I was very high on the Falcons signing Shaq Barrett in 2019. They did not choose to do that. They chose to do nothing that offseason in regards to their pass rush. And he went to Tampa Bay, signed a 1 year, $4 million a year, I think, deal with the Bucs, led the NFL in sacks in 2019, and then proceeded to get a much more lucrative long-term contract from the Bucs, made, I think, $68 million over the next 4 years before basically hanging it up. And so that, to me, again, is where I think the Falcons should be shopping if they're looking to get the most bang for their buck in free agency at the edge rusher position. Now, if they do get one of those tier one guys, you certainly will not hear me on this podcast complaining about it. My worry with that is the Falcons will spend a lot of money on those guys, similar to what they did back in 2020 with Dante Fowler, and then kind of just stood pat, where they just basically like, okay, well, we're going to draft Marlon Davidson. Fowler's going to upgrade the Beasley spot. Marlon Davidson is going to upgrade the Jack Crawford spot, and we've solved it. And I remember that offseason basically saying, like, no, you haven't, guys. And I remember getting a lot of feedback from, everydayers of the podcast, and those that weren't everydayers. They'll be like, you're being too negative on the podcast. And I'm just like, because people are going to get fired if they don't do more, and they were being way too complacent at that time. And I feel like there are some weird parallels with the current state of the Atlanta Falcons. That's weird. But hopefully we will see the Falcons, be aggressive to get one of these guys, either a tier one guy or a tier three guy in free agency. I wouldn't be upset if they went after a tier one and a tier three guy, but, I'm not going to hold my breath on that. So we'll see on that front. But, I think, or tier two, I'm sorry. Then I do think you do have a third tier, right? Where these guys to me are more backups, right? And these are the guys that I think you're really kind of looking for to kind of replace like James Smith-Williams or Lorenzo Carter, rotational pieces, maybe that third edge, backups alongside Braylon Trice next year. And that group consists of guys like Derek Barnett, Darrell Taylor, Chauncey Golston, Michael Hoyt, Joseph Osai, Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, Patrick Jones, Jacob Martin. Those to me are guys that I think can probably give you a little bit more juice than what Lorenzo Carter and James Smith-Williams gave you this past year, but also can, add some depth. And, some of those guys can play special teams. Some of those guys are good run defenders, all that sort of stuff. So back in rotational guys, but at least have flashed the ability that, they can produce when they're on the football field. So, if I was guessing right now, because we're a month away from free agency, I'm going into it with low expectations. I would actually expect the Falcons, if they're going to sign anybody in free agency, it'll be some tier three guy like Michael Hoyt or Joe Tryon-Shoyinka or something like that, and then just kind of draft a guy, and that will be what they do. That to me is kind of my low expectations for the Falcons offseason plans at edge rusher. And you guys know that I tend to set my expectations low, and even the Falcons, it's a challenge to how low can you set your expectations to see if the Falcons do not find a way to still disappoint you despite your extremely low expectations. And, I've been losing that challenge every year of my life. So we'll see what the Falcons wind up doing. But, maybe the Falcons don't necessarily need to be as aggressive adding edge in free agency or the draft, because Zach Harrison exists. And I'll break down why I think Zach Harrison is an asset, but not necessarily the answer at edge as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off, or you just want to wait to, bet that fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay, right? Wednesday night, the Atlanta Hawks are facing their old nemesis, the New York Knicks. And the Hawks are 8.5-point underdogs. And I saw a stat earlier today that the Hawks have won 4 out of our last 6 on the road against the Knicks. And so I feel like FanDuel is trying to tempt me, they're trying to get me in on that action. And so if you want to get in on the action as well as I am, just head on over to FanDuel.com, and new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So our next question comes from the Discord. Luke Jones. says, have you come to your senses yet that Zach Harrison is moving back to edge? On a more serious note, isn't this the exact role you projected for him back when you did his scouting report, Charles Omenihu, in this defensive scheme? And for context, Luke is one of several Falcon fans that has been beating the drum since last summer that Zach Harrison should have remained at edge, and the Falcons defense would have been benefiting that. Everydayers of this podcast know that I don't necessarily agree with that opinion. But yes, to answer your question, Luke, if the Falcons go back to a 4-3, and I still remain skeptical on whether they're going to be doing that, then Zach Harrison could fill the Charles Omenihu role in this defense, as we saw Charles Omenihu play in that Robert Saleh. Saleh was in New York there, but I guess that was D'Amico Ryans led defense in San Francisco, but very similar style defenses in that 4-3 defense. And Charles Omenihu, I believe, was my ceiling comp for Zach Harrison when we drafted him in terms of what I thought his max potential could be in the NFL. And that role is basically an edge rusher on early downs that kicks inside the D tackle on obvious passing downs and nickel and sub packages. And so that to me is the key part that folks like Luke seem to overlook, that in sub package that you're going to play 60-70% of the time, the guy's playing on the interior, not on the outside. And I feel like Charles Omenihu's best work as a pass rusher has consistently come on the interior rather than the outside, because his length, his power is something that creates more mismatch issues for guards than it does for tackles. Calais Campbell's the same way, and I think Zach Harrison is also the same type of player that can create those interior mismatches more so than the outside mismatches, because when you look at him as an outside rusher, he's purely a power guy, right? And he has the length and the power, to be an effective bull rusher and power rusher on the outside, but he lacks the bend and the burst to really challenge, to be able to convert those pressures that he's generating into, sacks and hits and whatnot, right? And so, he's quote unquote just a pressure guy as an edge rusher. And that's a big reason why I didn't necessarily like Zach Harrison as an edge rusher, because when I'm thinking about the fully realized version of the Falcons pass rush, which again, I know it's just a fantasy at this point in time. It's not a reality. It's a fantasy at this point in time, but we all daydream. I envision edge rushers that are not going to be just quote unquote pressure guys, but are actually getting home for the sacks. And that's not Zach Harrison. And instead, to me, the fully realized version of the Falcons pass rush, if Zach Harrison's part of that 4-man unit, he's going to be on the interior, not on the outside. So for me, that's kind of why I don't really think of Zach Harrison as a true blue edge, even if he can play there for 40% of the snaps or whatever it is. And again, I think this limitation of Zach Harrison is one of the reasons why he quote unquote had a disappointing career at Ohio State, right? He came into Ohio State with the expectation that he's going to be the next in line of the Nick Bosa's and the Chase Youngs, of being that high-end future number 1 pick as an edge rusher. And Ohio State tried to turn him into this very technical pass rusher. When I did my scouting report of him, when I did that initial Charles Omenihu comparison now almost 2 years ago, I noted that 45% of his wins came via speed and inside counter or technical moves, with that side scissors or swipe move being his preferred go-to pass rush move. And only about 25% of his wins came on power, even though he has 9 out of 10 power, that he has, I would argue, elite, maybe not the appropriate word, but near elite is probably pretty accurate in terms of his power, but he didn't use that. And he's gotten better at using that in the pros. And it's, to me, why he's been so effective when he's gotten those opportunities inside and outside in that regard. And so again, when you picture, a reality, an alternate reality, because Lord knows it's not going to be this reality, but an alternate reality where the Falcons have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse rushing the quarterback, are you picturing Zach Harrison as being part of that crew? And if you are you picturing him as an inside rusher or an outside rusher? And if you said outside, okay, that's fine, but as blunt as it sounds, your opinion is probably not one that I will hold in high regard when it comes to who do you think the Falcons pass rushers should be, right? That's basically what it is. Like, okay, like I'm not going to pay attention to your opinion when it comes to the Falcons pass rush. That's basically what I'm saying. If you see Zach Harrison as a high end edge rusher, right? And so to me, like if you see Zach Harrison as a high end edge rusher, then if you see his future as bright as an edge rusher, then there's really no reason for the Falcons to draft it or sign another edge rusher, right? Because it's like maybe they sign a backup, but it's like they already have Zach Harrison, they already have Arnold Ebiketie, so they're good at edge, right? Right? Because Zach Harrison's the answer at edge, right? The answer, okay, but he's not the answer. Clearly, he's not the answer. He's an asset, but he's not the answer. Because to me, like arguing that Zach Harrison is one of the answers at edge is like arguing in 2023 that Taylor Heinicke was the answer to solve the Falcons quarterback dilemma, as so many Falcon fans did. And I was just like, have you guys not watched Taylor Heinicke play? And this is not meant at you, Luke. We have a back and forth, so I'm fine with this. But this is more directed at everybody else that's pushing the Zach Harrison agenda at edge. That basically, unless you think Zach Harrison's going to be a 10-sack guy as an edge rusher, then what are we really talking about, right? Like that to me is kind of what I'm getting at with this sort of complacency where, like, to me, Zach Harrison probably maxes out as like a 4 to 6 sack guy as an edge rusher. Omenihu, basically outside of that 1 year in San Francisco, is basically that's what he's been. If you look at his averages, his per 17 game averages across his career, minus the 2022 season, where he probably had an obvious boost to his numbers playing with Nick Bosa, but he's averaged 4 sacks, 10 hits, and 35 pressures across 17 games, his entire career. And for the sake of comparison, Takk McKinley, in his 4 years in Atlanta, averaged 6 sacks, 16 quarterback hits, and 43 pressures every 17 games. So we're talking about a player that's, 40% less productive than Takk McKinley, and so when you look at a 4 to 6 sack guy as an edge rusher, that's nothing special, is basically the point. But a 4 to 6 guy as an interior guy, 4 to 6 sack guy as an interior guy, that hits a little bit differently. And by the way, we are pro Takk McKinley on this podcast. Fat Takk in 2018, outside of Grady Jarrett, is the best pass rusher this team has had in almost a decade. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to build off of that season due to injuries. But my ball knowers test, basically, if you know ball, you can answer this one question. I just have one question to ask you, and it's basically, what are your feelings on 2018 Fat Takk? Right? Is it strongly approve, somewhat approve, neither approve or disapprove, somewhat disapprove, or strongly disapprove? And there's only one correct answer that indicates that you know ball, and there's 4 wrong answers when it comes to that. But we'll talk about that at a later date. So we will move on from reminiscing about Fat Takk and talk instead about the other good pass rusher that the Falcons have had in the year since Fat Takk, which is Grady Jarrett, who is still going strong. But will the Falcons move on from Grady Jarrett this offseason? We'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So football season may be over, but basketball season is in full swing, and there's no better way to stay in the game than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With Prize Picks, it's easy. You just pick more or less on their player stat projections, and all you need is 2, right? You can pick 7 or 8 if you're feeling frisky, but you only need 2. And if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. And it's not just the NBA, it's college, b-ball, men's and women's, soccer, 4 nations, face-off, tennis, MMA, esports, and so much more available at Prize Picks. They even got 2025 season projections for passing, rushing, and receiving yards. So you can take more or less on Michael Penix, Bijan Robinson, Drake London's projections, as well as so many other NFL superstars. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5. Prize Picks, run your game. So our next question comes from Kai in the Discord. He says, do you think if Grady Jarrett doesn't take a pay cut, that he won't be a Falcon next year? I feel like everyone is pretty sure David will be cut, but Grady isn't a certainty. So yeah, I tend to agree. David Onyemata, I would be very surprised if the Falcons don't cut David Onyemata at this stage, but we'll see. They do weird stuff all the time. Grady Jarrett, I would be surprised is not the word. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if the Falcons cut Grady Jarrett. I would be just like, appalled. I guess is the word. I'd be like, how dare you? But I don't think it's going to come down to that sort of ultimatum in the way that you put it, Kai, because NFL teams are basically allowed to kind of restructure contracts without the player's permission. And so like, there's really no, it's not like they have to go to the player and like, you got to take a pay cut, my guy, or else we're going to cut you. Because I believe this also works for Grady, given that it's the final year of his contract, but they could do a max restructure of him, basically taking his $15.25 million base salary, reduce it down to the league minimum, which is about $1.255 million, and then taking that nearly $14 million difference, turning that into signing bonus. And if you tack on void years, because Grady Jarrett's in the final year of his contract in 2025, you could spread that $14 million in bonus money across multiple seasons and thus reduce his cap hit by at least probably $8 million. In terms of how many, depending on how many void years that you do. We also talked about this on Monday about doing a mini extension of Grady Jarrett that could also save you $10, $12 million, something in that range. So I don't expect the Falcons to cut Grady Jarrett, but and mostly because I think between Terry Fontenot, Raheem Morris, Jeff Ulbrich, and others in the building, there's a lot of people that are just big fans of Grady Jarrett and simply don't want to lose that veteran leadership. But it's certainly possible. It's a deep D tackle class by all accounts. We haven't really talked about D tackle being a priority early in the draft because of the presences of Grady Jarrett, Brandon Dorlus, Ruka Roro, Zach Harrison. They already have several guys that can play 5 technique and 3 technique. The one position on the D line that they lack right now is that 1 technique nose tackle. And that's typically not a position that you put a premium on unless you're the Tennessee Titans and Tavondre Sweat. But or the Dallas Cowboys and Masley Smith. One of those is seemingly working out and one of those is not so much. So we'll see with that. But it does kind of somewhat remind me of the 2020 offseason where around this time in early February, very few people thought cornerback was going to be the team's first round pick. But then the team cut Desmond Trufant in March. It's a post-June 1 cut. And then that changed that math real quick. So that's kind of stuff is makes me not put it past it that the Falcons could move on from Grady Jarrett. One way that we talked about it on Monday is like they could cut him and re-sign him. That's what the Eagles did with Fletcher Cox back in 2022, I believe it was. And I don't expect that to happen with Grady Jarrett because, like with Desmond Trufant, like he was hurt in 2019 before he was cut. Grady Jarrett was hurt in 2023, but was healthy last year and I think played much better in 2024 coming off the ACL tear than he played prior to the ACL tear in 2023. So I don't feel like Grady is as washed as maybe some people would argue at this stage in his career. I think you can still argue he's one of the 25 to 30 best interior pass rushers in the NFL. Now, certainly like 4 or 5 years ago, we were arguing that he was one of the 5 to 10 best interior pass rushers in the NFL. He's not that player anymore, but I still think a top 30-ish interior pass rusher is still very valuable in this league. I think it's extremely valuable for a team like the Falcons, right? And so that type of player is not worth $20 million, but I think that type of player is still worth $10 or $12 million, So if the Falcons can find a way to kind of cut Grady Jarrett's price tag in half, and they can do that simply without having to force him to take a pay cut, they can just kind of restructure the money and move money around or give a mini extension or whatever, all the ways we talked about, then I think it's worthwhile to bring him back, right? Grady gave this team 34 pressures last year, according to PFF. And this team, given where their pass rush is, can't really afford to let that level of production walk out the door scot-free, even if they're planning on replacing it with younger guys, because typically even first-round D tackles don't produce 34 pressures as rookies. Some do, but most don't. And so hopefully they learned that lesson from last year when they let a similar amount of production from both Bud Dupree and Calais Campbell walk out the door with really no plan of replacing them. So we'll see on that front. So hopefully Grady Jarrett will be back. Now our next question comes from Juke from the Discord. Eagles won the Super Bowl. What's the team building success they had that the Falcons can use? Again, there's no real deep analysis when it comes to the Eagles team building success. They've been building their team the same way for like 10 to 15 years, right? It's the same thing that we said 7 years ago when they won the Super Bowl. Trenches matter, right? The Eagles formula is we're going to be strong in the trenches. We're going to invest in premium positions. It's not really some, incredible strategy that they're employing. It's more their execution that they tend to do a better job executing that strategy than a lot of other teams that employ the exact same strategy, right? That's basically the lesson. Be better at your job. The Eagles, right? That's basically it. Just draft good players, sign good players, and you'll be successful. What a novel strategy. Seb's dad 19 asks, where do you prioritize that second safety position? Would you rather the Falcons address it in free agency or in the draft? Any notable free agent safeties that you see that complement Jesse Bates? So at this stage in the offseason, I tend to lean more towards free agency, but nobody really jumps out. I'll watch some more free agent safeties as we get closer to March. There are certainly guys that I know are good safeties, like Andre Sisco and Javon Holland. But in terms of saying like this guy is the perfect fit next to or near perfect fit next to Jesse Bates, we're at a wait and see at this time in the season. I'm just barely dipping my toe into some of the top draft prospect safeties as well. So the math may change in the next couple of weeks and whatnot. Last question comes from Ryan from a Locked On Falcons Insider. He says, what do you think the Falcons' priorities should be in free agency on the defensive side of the ball? And I think I talked about this a little bit on Monday's episode, but I would probably prioritize 4 positions in free agency, specifically on the defense side of the ball: nose tackle, edge rusher, nickel corner, and strong safety. That's how I lean today on February 11th as I record this. And as I watch more draft prospects and impending free agents over the next month, that opinion is likely to change. So we'll see how it changes. But that is going to do it for us here, guys, on our mailbag episode. If you want to submit questions via mailbag, of course, you can do so in 3 main ways. The number one priority, the people that get the most priorities, the Locked On Falcons insiders. They also get access to all my film breakdowns. I'll be looking at the DBs later this week. So if you want to get my thoughts on what I think of the top corners and top safeties in this year's draft class, probably on Friday, if all things go according to plan, you can sign up at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com. That's Locked On Falcons. And it's 14-day free trial. So you get that free, as well as probably my look at some of the other top edge rushers, as well as my previous looks at the top pass rushers that went to the Senior Bowl from last month, and my extended all 22 reviews. If you're, feeling nostalgic about, Kirktober or whatever, it's all available if you become a Locked On Falcons insider. 14-day free trial, $4.99 a month. The other way is via the Discord, link in the description below, to join that conversation and, watch people take shots at each other, like Luke Jones and others. Get in, choose a side on the Zach Robinson debate. Basically, is the only thing that you need to do to join the Discord. You either got to be a Zach Robinson lover or a Zach Robinson hater. So there's no fence sitting in the Locked On Falcons Discord. You will get called out. But that's one place where you can submit questions. And of course, you can do so via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And of course, you can leave a comment here on these videos. Not guaranteed I will read that comment, but hey, occasionally I do look at the comments and see a compelling question that can be a future question on a mailbag. So those are the ways that you can submit your questions to be answered on future podcast episodes. We're going to try to do more mailbags this off season. We haven't been able to do them as much just because there's been so much going on with the Falcons. There'll probably still be a lot going on with the Falcons. So, we might do like 2 the rest of the spring or whatever, but we'll see how it all plays out. But keep the mailbag questions coming. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out all the great shows across the Locked On Podcast Network as your second listen, including Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.